مقداره الانفجار الثاني وانفجارات كبيرة وهائلة، وربما هذا ما أشار له المسؤولون العسكريون.
The United States is in a state of confusion and surprise.
We fear this. We fear that they have something out that majority of the people don't know about.
Olan tüm halkların hakları gibi haklar. Ne aşağı ne yukarı. Ne fazla ne az.
Pent-up feelings that may result from decades of repression and people who've had members of their family killed by that regime.
A lot of killers. You get a lot of killers. Why, you think our country's so innocent?
But I won't attack it because someone sicks me on. I don't let anybody use me to fight their battles.
Hello and welcome to Nailing It Down, a Varn blog short. Now, this one's going to be a little different. Normally in Nailing It Down, I cover a singular topic and go into its applications. But this, I'm going to actually start synthesizing some discussions that I've been part of and following for nigh a decade that are related to the left, in fact, vitally related to the left, but are not commonly spoken about in the left. Now, I'm going to say that I am picking up on the discussions of both the What is Politics channel and Fight Like an Animal by Arnold Schroeder. And in fact, in the show notes to this, I'm going to link both. And I'm going to strongly tell people to read the working bibliography for the first two episodes of Fight Like an Animal. For a more popular presentation for some of the ideas I'm going to discuss, I'm going to suggest people go read the kind of out of date now, but they're from about 10 years ago book, Jonathan Haidt's Moral Foundations, and Joshua Greene's Moral Tribes, which go into some of the research on temperament and both personal temperament according to the 5-factor personality trait and political outcomes. Now, what is interesting is the 5-factor personality traits such as conscientiousness or openness to experience are more predictive of the left-right spectrum than any other factor like race, social economic class, or religion, or any other number of factors using liberal demographic factors for the individual. Now that's important. We'll come back to it in a minute. Study after study confirms this, and it is truly cross-cultural. However, the content of someone's politics, i.e., whether or not they will support left or right policy, is not predictive by this. It is whether or not they will identify with our left or right-wing movement. And by that, I mean left-wing movements are generally associated with openness towards other people, openness, relatively egalitarian notions of power sharing, openness to experience, and right-wing politics being defined by politics largely based off fear, preservation of old social orders, preservation of power structures, etc. Now, those definitions are not actually definitions that a Marxist would use, but we'll come back to that later. Now, this leads us to a paradox, though, that Arnold Schroeder doesn't answer directly, but he kind of answered it indirectly in an interview he did with DB from What is Politics. See, Schroeder pointed out that there was a tendency to assume that someone's individual demographic factor kind of bracketed them and explained their politics, and so we can see, upper middle class black person is a representative of all black people, and then a reactionary black person can't be a thing because their position as a marginalized person would not lead them to be invested in entrenched power structures, etc. These are kind of stereotypical arguments you see from social constructivists and a lot of leftists, particularly liberal leftists, but you see it with even Marxists in the way they argue about class in the same way. They think that the aggregate can be broken down to the individual. Now, Marx himself did not think that, but this is not just me defending Marxism. This is showing you how to think. In both areas, you have a problem with the part to whole fallacy. All right. So, in the case of the openness to experience being a cross-cultural, cross-class phenomenon and predicting outlier politics in the conservative or left direction, the top 20%, of the most activated 20% of the population, we immediately start seeing something. Okay, so that one trait, regardless of your social class, your background, etc., if you have extreme opinions and extreme temperament scales in either one, it can predict left or right politics pretty consistently in the individual. But why then does region, age, and economic status predict things better in aggregate? And what Schroeder didn't really go into, but I think was actually quite interesting, is that 80% of the population is not, roughly 80%, is not in the outlier factor. And we see this even like in the Pew poll I mentioned in a couple weeks ago when I was talking about how God and Guns conservatives and progressives are, the two smallest factions of American politics, but they're also the most clearly identifiable and the ones we focus on. They're the extreme outliers on both ends, with even more extremes, beyond that are, and even if you include their larger, broader categories, so if you add national conservatives and then you add, outsider leftists, which include everyone from moderates to some kinds of socialists, the way the Pew poll defined it, you get it up to like basically 17% and 20% together. So you're dealing with a little more, but you're still dealing with a majority or the minority of people. Well, there's another book called The Other Divide, which you should check out, which indicates that actually the biggest divide in most people's lives is an annoyance with politics because they feel like neither polarized position represents them, but they do identify more with one position or the other. If you go back to Arnold's admission that most people actually fall in the center of the spectrum of left and right as far as temperament, then other factors would explain aggregate politics, meaning relationships, economics, regional economies, etc., will explain what is going on in the larger group. Now, this is interesting. Other high predictors of one's politics is your income. All right. Whether or not you're a Democrat or a Republican in aggregate is predicted kind of by your income. Democrats are the very poor, and people make over $200,000 a year. Republicans tend to be a bracket between about $70,000 and $80,000 a year. But again, that's not predictive in the individual. You cannot deduce, even probabilistically, a trend in a large group from a trait in an individual. So this is a statistical lesson for you and a lesson in basic logic. That's the part, the whole fallacy and the whole apart fallacy. You can't do it. All right. Now, Marx doesn't do it. This is why Marx talks about individuals proletarianizing, understanding that their future is in the proletariat. And why you can see in the individual is not a predictor of the entirety of the class. So your class origins are not a predictor of your politics, according to Marx. Right? It is a class as a whole whose politics are predictive, but not an individual. Now, Marx doesn't think in this kind of analytic way that we're using now. He's using Hegelian methodologies. He's using early anthropology, very early anthropology. We're talking like 1850s level anthropology, right? It's not even a separate subject. So, where does this get me here? Well, we have two things. Now, I didn't answer age. The reason why age is a conservative factor is you are closer to death. Being closer to death tends to induce fear, and fear in almost all primates makes you act more conservatively, more defensively, more defensive of the status quo. All right. Now, this brings me to another concept. I've talked a lot about nature. So one thing Schroeder points out is any individual in any group, be it class, race, whatever, gender, will have the similar spectrum of temperaments, with the outliers of extreme conservatism and extreme leftism being relatively consistent. And they do have comorbid, like when comorbid here does not mean death related, it just means happens to coincide with it. Sociological traits. So, for example, people who are really open to experience tend to get higher levels of education, etc. Okay, now let's be materialist here. Now, materialism in our context, in the context coming out of Marxism, whether you're a Marxist or not, includes more than just economics. That's what a lot of people seem to think it means. But economics is part of the social reproduction of society through material means. So materialism also includes social relations and biology. Now, for some reason, having to do with debates in the 1950s around like which science we should base ourselves off of, physics or linguistics, leftism kind of got stuck in this idea that social constructivism and biological determinism were at odds. And we started getting philosophically into these contingency versus determination debates. But in reality, even gene expression itself, and as I've talked about in a recent interview on gender expression as well, has both social and biological correlates, all right, that change. The Norman Geras wrote a book called Marxist Defense of Human Nature, which talks about human nature being socially bounded. Now, people who study anthropology, other than David Graeber and David Wrengrow, know that human social environments are highly variable. Is monogamy or polyamory or polygamy more true to human nature? Well, frankly, depending on the society, none or all are true to human nature in certain conditions under certain constraints. As Marx said, people make their own history, but it's not of their own making, right? Another insight that Marx has that is really interesting is social science. See, we're stuck in debates about contingency versus determinism, where science has moved on and talks about probability or what is most likely. All right, now, there are material constraints on social relations. For example, we can talk about the egalitarian revolution of the Homo erectus when we figured out how to make pointy sticks, and thus in the alpha male thing development patterns of most primates. If we all have pointy sticks, and it is kind of like, it's actually weirdly conservatives make this argument about guns, but it's true. If we all have weapons that can kill each other, then it's really hard to have physical dominance in the same way that you see with gorillas and chimpanzees. But even with gorillas and chimpanzees, particularly with chimpanzees, there are times where we see bands get rid of the alpha males. Because if dominance is a innate trait in certain primates, so is counter dominance, or the removal of the dominant factor. People don't like being dominated. And so once we invented pointy stick weapons to hunt, we also realized we could use it to make sure that the alpha males didn't dominate, and we had a relatively egalitarian band society in early societies that were subsistence hunter-gatherers that didn't deal with surplus. Okay. There's a lot of ways in which it's going to wash out, patriarchal, non-patriarchal, how this comes in, relationship, agriculture, changing all this. But there are probabilistic determinations. There's only so many ways these societies can go, and there's a probability of the most likely outcome. Now, there are outliers that come in any form. Now, this gets us back to why does economics and regional economics, and I think people don't need to think, oh, just workers are not conservative. No, different areas of the economy tend towards different kinds of outcomes for a reason. This is why I'm always talking about being more specific in your class analysis than this person is a worker. Well, yeah, but in aggregate, yes, workers have the interest of, their subsistence being exploited and getting rid of that. But the way that's going to be expressed in both what Pierre Bourdieu would call habitus and what we might see as sectional differences in the economy is going to be wildly different, because the incentives are wildly different. So, for example, I used to wonder, why is it that rural people tend to be more conservative and less open to experience than urban people? That just doesn't, if we assume it's human nature and we see that this pattern is relatively innate, why does it sort this way? Well, it sorts this way because there are other factors in aggregate that will affect your personality, because your nature is environmentally and socially bounded. All right. Now, this is where my concept comes in. Instead of talking about social constructivism and human nature, or even species being the old Marxist word for human nature from Hegel, we should talk about biological tendencies and social binding. So how we socially interact with each other, because this is part of our nature as a social species. It's how we've survived. It's how we're so adaptable. Does change even the physical things we manifest genetically. All right. Not just in sexual selection, not just in natural selection, which is who gets to live or die before they procreate, but also in what what things are triggered either epigenetically or through environmental triggers for gene expression. All right. Changes depending on the situation. Meaning, the whole social constructivism versus biological essentialism is a non-debate. It is kind of looking at only one side of the larger equation of materialism. Right? And there's a reason why we use material. Because in Marxism, your material reality is constructed by social reproduction. Social reproduction, sounds biological, but also includes things that aren't. Now, you'll notice I'm not using the word natural. What does natural mean? It either means everything, because everything that exists is natural unless you have some metaphysical assumptions that create abilities for it not to be, or things that are not human by definition, because the natural world is what we are not taking involved in because it's not altered by us. Well, that second definition is not all encompassing and thus coherent, but we can't talk about humans being natural in that sense. It becomes a non-useful category for talking about people. The former category would be useful for talking about people if it refers to biology, but then anything we do socially would also have to be seen as an extension of that biology, and thus nothing could be said to be unnatural because it existed in the first place. Now, this is a logical and semantic argument, all right? But it's why I don't use that term. It's why I use the term material, because material is about the social way that we construct our material world. That is why economics in the bourgeois world is part of it. And it's why political economy is part of it. It's why political science is politics, where politics emerges. But we can't assume the individual and the aggregate are the same. Now, you notice I'm saying aggregate, not collective. All right. The collective is the unitary vision of the aggregate. It is always imaginary. So when we envision, a racial collective, we have an idea of what that is. It's usually where our biases come in and this and the other. So I've been trying to get people to quit talking about, well, there's material and ideology, and there's material. No. All right. First off, what's going to predict someone's politics is based on their values, and their values have a relatively even spread in temperament cycles. Now, I like to refer to these as temperaments because they're related to the 5 traits, and because you can actually put some of the same policy content in either position. So, for example, we could talk about conservative Marxists in the USSR who were still Marxists. All right. We can talk about people who have conservative values but actually want progressive social policy but don't vote for it. But we also have to look at the fact that 80% of the population isn't really highly politically motivated. And so other factors than political ideology or even ideological temperament are going to be what decides where they end up. They're the apolitical mass. And in the book, The Other Divide, they're the 80% of the population that kind of cares about politics, and they're kind of polarized because they listen to the people in their region. But if you really ask them, they just want you to shut the hell up about politics because they're tired of these politicized, polarized weirdos. Now, if this view of bounded sociality, if this view of using materialism, and we'll talk about historical materialism and deep anthropology later in some of these theories, helps you, I hope you understand now why I take some of these political anthropologists and intellectual historians of deep human history seriously. It's also why I do the stuff I do on early medieval transitions, on Marxist typologies, and all this. This is not to get you to believe in some cargo code theory of Marx where I'm going to give you the perfect answer. My bounded sociality is just a neologism that I'm using to express something that talks about how social construction is important, but there are still innate traits. And innate traits are spread fairly evenly across the population in a lot of ways because they're all survival adaptive. I hope you find this interesting, and I'm going to be doing more of these. I'm going to link to both Arnold and What is Politics in the show notes, as well as some. I'm also going to mention the books that I brought up so you can look them up. And I hope you have a great day.